It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a recession is going to come. They always eventually do. Since the dawn of modern financial market history, we've seen recessions come. Now, these may not look very important on this long-term chart of GDP, but these slight bumps are often associated with high levels of unemployment, and unfortunately, these periods where economic activity is contracting are for many reasons unavoidable. They help clear out unproductive individuals from businesses, and they also clear out unprofitable businesses from the economy. But the big question that has always kept economists on their toes is, when is the next one going to come around? Back in 2022, most economists agreed that a recession was inevitable. Of course, so far they've ended up being wrong, as we haven't actually witnessed a recession yet, at least not according to the NBER, the official organization that labels recessions. We've seen 12 recessions labeled by the NBER since 1948. That's around one every 6 years or so, and on average they last around 10 months. But since 1980, we've seen recessions occur around every 10 years. It seems recessions are occurring less frequently as time has moved on, and we actually recently saw a recession back in 2020. So should we expect the next recession to only come around in 2026 or possibly even in 2030? We first need to define the term recession. It's when the unemployment rate is rising. That's probably the most simple way to actually describe what a recession is. Rising unemployment is one of the key metrics that the NBER uses to label recessions. If the unemployment rate begins to rise, people are losing their jobs and the economy is contracting. We don't see recessions without the unemployment rate rising. The reason you see unemployment rise during recession is typically because we've seen some shock that hits the economy. In 2007, the housing bubble burst, which triggered the global financial crisis. In 2001, the tech bubble burst, and that was quickly followed by a recession. In 1990, you saw an oil shock from the war in Kuwait that paralyzed the economy. Every time it seems to be a different event that triggers a downturn. But there's actually one thing that all of these episodes have in common. The housing market weakens every time leading up to recessions. This chart is the housing market index, but it's inversed. So when it's rising, it means the housing market is weakening. Almost every time that it weakens, you see a recession follow soon after. If we add the unemployment rate on top, you'll see that it kind of follows what the housing market is doing, but lagged. When we shift forward the housing market index by around a year and a half, it's almost a perfect match that tells us that the housing market is a great predictor of where the unemployment rate is going over the next 18 months. And if we're following the same path today, it's suggesting that the unemployment rate should be rising over the next 18 months. And this is one of the factors that actually goes in favor of seeing a recession in 2024. Housing has weakened considerably in 2022. Housing mortgage rates went from around 2%, the lowest level in history, to around 7%, the highest level in over 20 years. So of course that has led to a drop in activity in the housing market compared to 2021. When less people are buying homes, it means less people are going to be buying things for their homes over the next couple of years, and that weakens the economy. It's also why we're giving 1 month of our service out for free this week to give everybody access to our market forecasts. Don't miss that opportunity. But of course, no relationship is perfect in financial markets. There are always exceptions. What if we see something like what happened in 1995, where the housing market actually recovers and the unemployment rate just stays low, and you didn't see a recession until 2001? One of the reasons this could actually happen is that US corporations have $200 billion in cash today. That's one of the highest levels of corporate cash we've seen in history. This is basically all leftover money from the trillions of dollars that the government spent on economic stimulus during the pandemic. In fact, these high levels of corporate cash back in 2021 is one of the key reasons why we were able to avoid a recession, despite the fact that we saw an oil shock during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Companies just dug down into their cash reserves instead of laying off workers. Now, cash levels are back above $200 billion, which still makes corporations quite capable to weather through the next period of turbulence by just digging into their cash pile again. And one of the reasons why corporations would actually want to do that is because companies are struggling to find workers. There's something called the labor force participation rate, and it's at one of the lowest levels of the last 30 years. That means there's less people looking for a job than at almost any moment of the last 30 years. In the early 2000s, around 67% of the population was participating in the workforce workforce. So corporations back then were a lot more willing to actually fire workers because they knew they were going to be able to find people when the time came to hire again. And so that allowed recessions to occur in 2001 and 2008. But that participation has come down significantly since then, where many people just left the workforce altogether. In 2022, companies knew that workers were very precious, and so they preferred just to lose money instead of firing people. Today, the labor force participation rate is a little bit higher, so many people have returned to the workforce, but it's still much below the levels that we saw before the pandemic. Now, when we zoom out all the way to 1948, we see that there has been periods in history where the labor force participation rate was lower than today. In the 1970s, 60s, and 50s, for example, that a low participation rate didn't stop recessions from occurring back then. So whether we are actually able to avoid a recession today depends on how quickly the housing market can recover. If housing stays very weak, corporations are not going to be willing to go through their cash indefinitely. They're eventually going to need to downsize, begin laying people off, which would kick off the next recession probably in 2024. If the housing market recovers very quickly, then you could potentially see a scenario where corporations just eat through $30-40 billion worth of cash during these difficult conditions, but we never actually see the recession materialize. So that would basically be the same thing to what we saw in 1996, where the housing market recovered very quickly and the US economy completely avoided a recession. Now, whether we see this scenario actually happen almost entirely depends on what mortgage rates are going to do next. Just as rising mortgage rates caused the housing market weakness in 2022, if we see mortgage rates come back down, that could lead the housing market to recover very quickly. Again, that's what happened in 1996 right here. You saw mortgage rates rise very aggressively, freezing the housing market, but that was quickly reversed and mortgage rates actually came back down to the level they were at before they even began to rise. Now you can see mortgage rates have come down a little bit over the last few months, but the only way that can actually continue is if the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, begins to cut interest rates. The Federal Reserve by far has the largest influence on what mortgage rates do. When they decide to raise interest rates like they've been doing over the past couple of years and like they did in 1995, you're going to see mortgage rates rise. When they cut interest rates, you're going to see mortgage rates fall, and that can allow the housing market to recover. When the Fed cuts interest rates, they're basically lending money to other banks at cheaper rates, and that allows those banks to lend money at cheaper rates to people who want to buy homes. That's why the central bank directly influences mortgage rates. One of the reasons they could actually decide to cut interest rates quite quickly from here is that inflation has come back down to 3% after having hit 9% in 2022. That means that the Federal Reserve's interest rate is now above the inflation rate, and that's usually what they target. In fact, when we look at the probability of where the Fed interest rate is going to be based on market data, the market is expecting the Federal Reserve to begin cutting rates by March of 2024, and for it to be below 5% by June of 2024, and potentially down to 4% by the end of 2024. So if we haven't seen a recession really materialize by then, it's possible that the rate cuts would actually allow mortgage rates to drop, the housing market to boom, and so the economy avoid a recession. And that would look a lot like what we saw in 1996, where we saw no recession over the next year, and in fact no recession materialized until 2001. But there is one key difference to note between today and 1996, and that's how much the banking system is lending. This is a chart that shows us how many banks in the US are limiting the amount of lending that they're doing. The higher it is, the less banks are lending. The lower it is, the more banks are lending money. Since the beginning of 2022, banks have been lending less and less money. They've been tightening their lending standards. And you can see that's quite a bit different to what was going on in 1996. And if we add the unemployment rate on top, you can see that these lending standards often predict what the unemployment rate is going to do in advance. Just like the housing market, when we shift lending standards forward by a year and a half, they almost fit. It perfectly predicted the top of the unemployment rate in 1990, in 2001, and in 2008, a full year and a half in advance. The only exception to this is actually COVID-19, where the unemployment rate spiked overnight because of global lockdowns. So from this angle, the situation today looks quite a bit different to 1996, a period where banks were still lending money. Today, they've been limiting the amount of money that they actually lend, and so that eventually translates into rising rising unemployment and so a recession. It's even telling us that the unemployment rate could rise throughout 2024 and it could peak towards the end of 2024. Now, again, if companies decide to dig into their $200 billion worth of cash reserves to avoid firing workers, they could decide to just fire their worst employees and wait till things get better next year, and you'd only see a very slight rise in the unemployment rate. That is what's called the soft landing scenario. And it's actually what the stock market is pricing in today. The soft landing would be an ideal scenario for the stock market and could allow it to continue moving higher like it did after 1996 and potentially head into a massive bubble over the next few years just like it did back then. Now, what we're telling our clients at Game of Trades is that this scenario isn't very likely to happen. At the very least, we expect a recession to materialize in 2024 and for the stock market to price that in. The big question we should be asking is how quickly is all of this going to be playing out?